Hi everyone, it's William. It's Friday the 25th of October 2024 and it's sunny here in the Portland area as you can see, so that's very nice, but it's also cold as you can see. I don't know what the weather is in Davos at the moment. I should check the live cam at Schatzalp. But okay, what I should have started by saying, instead of giving you a weather report, is that this is my YouTube series, Life on the Magic Mountain, comparing Thomas Mann's description of life in a Davos sanatorium between the years 1907 and 1914 with the reality of what life was like in a sanatorium. And I myself am connected as the historian to Hotel Schatzalp, which was probably the most famous sanatorium in Davos when it was a sanatorium until 1953. So, yeah, my research and my residence there at Schatzalp for about 3 months a year have hopefully given me some insight that maybe literary critics looking at this book generally lack. I am not a literary critic, so this is a historian's view, and not only a historian's view, but the view of a historian who is specifically interested and researching this topic. Okay, and we're also comparing Hans Castorp's experience at his Davos sanatorium, the Berghof, with the experience of a real life patient who was at sanatorium Schatzalp between 1939 and 1942, and that was Grand Duke Dmitry of Russia, a Romanov Grand Duke in exile after the Russian Revolution. Okay, so today's chapter is called Politically Suspect. Politically Suspect. Maybe politically suspicious would be a better word, but anyway, one of Thomas Mann's ironic titles. And if you're wondering what it is in this chapter that is found to be politically suspect, it is music. So go figure. That's not the thing that would immediately come to mind, is it? But in thinking about this topic, I realized, yeah, okay, that makes some sense. And music can be politically suspect, or at least it can be politically connected, very strongly so. So I think about the presidential elections in the U.S., which are going on right now, and both Kamala Harris on the side of the Democrats and Donald Trump on the side of the Republicans have music that they use at all of their rallies, that those songs have now taken on a political tone. And so in the case of Donald Trump, some of the composers and singers of the songs have weighed in, and it's even gone to court in one instance to say, no, we don't want this song to be associated with what you stand for politically. And Kamala Harris has endorsements and support from various American pop singers like Taylor Swift and Beyonce. And so, yeah, this is a perfect instance of music taking on a political tone, music that wasn't necessarily, and in most instances wasn't written to have any kind of political message. So I also think of the movie Cabaret from the 1970s about Weimar Germany, and a famous scene in a beer garden where a Hitler Youth stands up and sings a patriotic song, Tomorrow Belongs to Me, and it's the pivotal moment for two of the characters, one who denies that the Nazi Party will ever be more than a collection of buffoons, and one who, there's a scene as they're getting into their car after leaving the beer garden, and the one says to the other, now what does he say? I should have looked that up. Do you really think you can control them? And that's really the pivotal scene in the movie. So that's a powerful scene involving music. I think, of course, of the bridge on the River Kwai, the famous song that Alec Guinness leads his British prisoners of war in a Japanese internment camp. He leads them to their daily work, whistling this song to boost their morale. And since what they're doing is building a bridge that will be strategically important to the Japanese, that song too takes on something of a political tone, because the morale boost ends up being tied in with the work, which is really something that is good for the Japanese and not for the British. So that's another interesting example. And when it comes to novels, I think of another novel of Thomas Mann's, Dr. Faustus, which centers around the life of a German composer who makes a deal with the devil, so to speak. And it also has political overtones. And then finally, I think of Proust. And everybody knows the story, everybody who's into literature, I should say, knows the story of how eating dipping a cookie into lime tea brings back this flood of memories to the main character, who had the same thing as a child, and so it brings back all his childhood memories. But that cookie isn't the only thing that is a link to emotions and memories and all the important things in the book. At least in the first two novels, it's it's music. It's a song that one of the main characters, Swan, finds so haunting that it really changes the course of his life. So those are just some examples. I probably shouldn't have spent 8 minutes on that. So let's take a look at this chapter. It's a short one, and it's centered around a band concert that we're told it's a Sunday with a band concert on the terrace offered every 14 days as the way of marking the passage of 2 weeks. So we have the idea here that the doctors themselves, Dr. Behrens and Dr. Kukowski, are aware of how time becomes non-time at a sanatorium, and so they want to give a sort of anchor to the patients so that they're not lost to the sense of time. After all, the hope is that they'll recover and they'll go back to everyday life, and so it's good to not have them completely overwhelmed by this sense of being in a kind of non-time zone. So I can't speak for that, how accurate that was. I can only say that Schatzalp had weekly concerts every Wednesday, sometime on Sundays, but they were not in the sanatorium. Schatzalp sort of uniquely was up on a mountainside with a big tourist draw on the same mountainside, also belonging to the sanatorium. The same people who owned the sanatorium owned these other facilities. They're right next door to the sanatorium. You have a restaurant with a weekly tea and dance and concert, and you have a world-class bobsledding run, one of the most important in Europe, as it turns out, right next door to the sanatorium. The starting point for that bobsled run was there next door to Schatzalp, and it was called the Schatzalp Bob Bahn. And so the patients don't seem to have gone to the restaurant for these weekly concerts. So if there was music provided for them in-house, I don't have any records of that, unfortunately. And one thing that I know that they did offer was movies. So not at the time that Hans Castorp would have been in Davos, but at the time that Grand Duke Dmitri was in Davos in a sanatorium at Schatzalp, he informs us that they had weekly movies at Schatzalp, and he would usually try to go to those if he could. It always depended on if you were confined to bed or to your room based on your physical condition. But when he could, he did go to those. And unfortunately, the only one he mentions by name is the movie Snow White, which I believe was released in 1938 or 1939. It was the first of Walt Disney's very famous early animated movies, and he'd never seen anything like it before, and he was pretty blown away by it. Even though it was a children's movie, he mentions it by name and talks about how impressed he was by it. So yeah, these weekly movies would have been a way to do the same thing that the band concerts did in the Magic Mountain. Okay, so now we get a description from Thomas Mann about what that scene is like. It's August, so they're doing it out in front of the sanatorium. The weather was good, and he says 3 or 4 of the chairs in the arcade were occupied, but the majority of the guests sat at little white tables placed out on the covered porch, although frivolous and fashionable society, for whom sitting on chairs was apparently too respectable, took up a position on the stone steps. So we have three different options here. You could sit in a chair in the arcade. You could sit on one of the little white tables that was specifically placed out there by the management, or you could sit on the stone steps. So how does this apply to Schatzalp? Well, it's a very similar setup there. There is a covered arcade, and during the sanatorium era, it did indeed have chairs, wicker chairs. It did not have Liegestühle, where people went, these extending lounge chairs that people went to recline on and wrap up and do their rest cure. It had just chairs that you would sit up in, I should say. And it was a place where people socialized, even when there was snow outside. I have pictures from 1910 and 1914 of people out on the arcade sitting in these wicker chairs and socializing, including a picture of Dimitri with some friends doing just that, but also these earlier photos as well. So apparently the Berghof, which in reality was the sanatorium, the Wald Sanatorium, had also a covered porch. So Schatzalp has a covered arcade, which I suppose you could call a covered porch. It's also called the Wandelgang in the 1910 photo album I have. The patient who took those photos refers to it as the Wandelgang. And right now, in modern-day Hotel Schatzalp, it's called the Snow Beach, and you have tables with little white tablecloths, little table with white tablecloths, and you also have Liegestühle, and so you can still go and have that experience. You can still go and sit in a wicker chair at a little white table, and it's absolutely splendid. The view at Schatzalp much better than the view at the Berghof / Wald Sanatorium, Wald Hotel, because Schatzalp is pretty high up on the mountainside and an absolutely marvelous view of the valley. Okay, so also on special occasions, I was at Schatzalp once on August 1st, the Swiss National Day, and the management did exactly this. They put the tables out front so that we could watch the fireworks from across the valley, and it was a beautiful evening, really a wonderful evening. So that experience is still fully available. And the other thing that he describes is the stone steps. So the young people and the fashionable people are sitting together on the stone steps. Well, Schatzalp also has stone steps in front of the glassed-in foyer, and people still sit on them. And I like sitting on the steps sometimes myself. If I've come up from a hike, and I want to get the little rocks and clean up my hiking boots a little, I like to sit there on the stone steps and do that in the evening, or when the hotel is closed, when I'm staying there as the hotel in residence, the historian in residence, to do my research. That's part of my routine every day. And if I'm lucky, one of the cats who are outside in the evening will come and sit next to me. That's my favorite thing when I do that. Okay, so we can move on from that. And now, instead of talking about the physical environment, we're talking a bit about the patients. And we're told that there's a red-haired young lady from Greece, and that caught my attention, not because of the red hair, but because of the association of Greeks with the Davos sanatoriums. So for some, there were always Greek patients. I mean, Greece was not a wealthy country at that time. I have no idea if it is or is not now, but at that time it was not a rich country. There was a lot of poverty there. There was a lot of tuberculosis there. But these, if you were at Schatzalp or at the Wald Sanatorium, you were a person of means, or a person from a family that had means. But so there were always patients from Greece, but then in 1921 there was an explosion of patients from Greece, and I haven't figured that out yet. I haven't gone and done the specific research that I need to do on what was going on in Greece, and if there was a spike in tuberculosis at that time. But not just Schatzalp, but all of the sanatoriums in 1921 just filled up with Greek patients. And at Schatzalp, indeed, I keep track of the nationalities that were there, and usually, almost always, there are more German patients than any other group of people. But in 1921, the Greeks at Schatzalp, as in the other sanatoriums, were vastly in the majority. And so that's very intriguing, and I really want to find out what caused that. All right, and then we don't really learn anything about the red-haired young Greek lady. Instead, we focus on another patient who is a boy. Schatzalp did not treat children. There were special TB sanatoriums for children because the childhood form of the disease was, in most cases, very different from the adult form of the disease, although you did have children sometimes who would have the adult form of the disease. But in this case, we're talking about a teenager. So the description, in quotes, is that this was a 15 or 16-year-old boy who squinted through a monocle and at every cough put his little finger, its long nail-shaped, very much like a salt cellar spoon, to his lips. He had been only very slightly ill on arrival with no temperature. His being sent up with was more of a precautionary measure by his father, a physician, and had been advised by the director that he would have to stay about 3 months with a temperature between 100. Okay, darn it! When I was transcribing this on my computer, I forgot part of it. So the missing part is that he was sent there in a state of good health, relatively speaking, but instead of then spending the 3 months, he got genuinely sick with a daily temperature between 100 and 100.4 degrees. He was seriously ill, we're told. So I suppose that's debatable, because nowadays, if you look up what constitutes a fever, usually they say you're not considered to have a fever until you have 100.4. So Hans Castorp stays on for for 7 years because he has a fever that's in the 99-degree range. I'm sorry, I should have looked this up in Celsius. I do the weather temperatures every day in Celsius. So what would that have been? Well, I mean, a fever 39, 40, but I don't know where the cutoff would be in Celsius. But so this young man wasn't with a fever of 100 and 104. I think a modern day doctor would, yeah, sit up and pay notice to that, pay attention to that if it was steady and if it wasn't determined to be his normal temperature. But it's with children, a lot of times they had, instead of sanatoriums, they had places called preventatoriums. I hope that I have that right. Preventoriums or preventatoriums. Because the childhood disease was so different from the adult disease, that usually when children got tuberculosis, they would beat it off. It would be like, usually it was like a really bad cold with pleurisy. Pleurisy was kind of the classic sign. If a child had pleurisy, they'd probably picked up a tuberculosis infection, and they would recover the same way you would from a bad cold that turned into pleurisy, and their bodies would wall off the tuberculosis behind a calcium deposit, and they would go on and recover, and in most cases, in 90% of cases, they would not develop, they would never have TB as an active disease. So only about 10% of people would go on to have active disease, and usually when they were adults and not when they had their initial infection, when they were children. So children who had these bouts of pleurisy and this initial TB infection, or children who came from a family where there were adults who had tuberculosis, or other family members who had tuberculosis, especially if they had a parent in a sanatorium, would be sent to a preventatorium where they would live in the open air and have a healthy diet, and they weren't really sick, but they were there to recover, or just to just through healthy living to make sure that they were to ensure that they wouldn't develop active disease in later life. But this young man, of course, is 15, 16, and if he has TB, then he doesn't have the juvenile form of the disease. He has a reactivation of something that he would have contracted when he was a child. And with the Hans Castorp too, there's a misconception that Hans Castorp has tuberculosis, and he actually does not. The whole point is that he's being strung along by the doctor, by Dr. Behrens, because he's a wealthy young man, and Dr. Behrens tells him, well, let's be on the safe side and keep you here. But the fact of the matter is, what Dr. Behrens finds are these walled off calcium places in his lungs that show that he did have it as a child, and his immune system was able to overcome it. And Dr. Behrens famously tells him, but one of them is a moist spot. But that is just rubbish. It's just rubbish. He doesn't have tuberculosis. He's not in danger at this point in his life as a healthy young man in his 20s of developing tuberculosis. If anything, the danger comes from being in the sanatorium itself and, being exposed so that he could have another infection, a reinfection. And okay, anyway, so let's see. I wanted to bring up that of all the patients, not many patients actually list their profession. So there were published guest lists if you're watching one of these for the first time. And the people who came to Davos as tourists or as sanatorium patients were required to register, and the sanatoriums and the hotels sent those lists to be published every week, if you can imagine, in one of the local journals, newspapers. But the patients were given the discretion to put what name they wanted to and what information they wanted to. All they had to put was an initial, a surname, and a place. That was it. Whether it was their hometown or whether they'd simply been staying in Paris for a month before they came to Davos, they were only required to put an initial, a surname, and a place. But many of the patients went further than that voluntarily. They put their full name and the city and country where they lived, and sometimes they also even put their profession. So, not many of them, though. But from what I've been able to gather from poring over the guest list, if there was any profession that was well represented above all others, it was medical doctors. So there were lots of doctors. You know, you would identify yourself as Dr. Müller instead of Herr Müller. But you don't know if that person, I have a doctorate, but it's in Russian history. So if I am on the books at Schatzalp as Dr. Lee, it's not for any medical reason. So there were medical doctors there who identified themselves as medical doctors, and they seemed to constitute the most prominent profession at the sanatoriums. And I suspect that a lot of the others who identified themselves as doctor were in fact medical doctors, but there was no way for me to tell that. And why were they going to sanatoriums in large numbers? Was it because they had contracted TB themselves in their profession? And there certainly was always that danger, or was it because they were coming to have a first-hand look at a sanatorium themselves? Well, usually you can tell that by how long they're staying. Of course, if they're only there for 2 weeks, then it was probably just a visit to check the place out and learn more about TB. And there were lots of visiting doctors that would come to Davos in groups to have a look at the sanatoriums, and apparently some of them came also individually to actually stay at a sanatorium. And there were, in fact, some instances that I know of where doctors came both as patients and as learners and as apprentices. So you have one doctor who came in 1939 from Ireland who was a sort of apprentice to Dr. Maurer, the head doctor at that time, but he was also a patient. He also had tuberculosis, so he was able to sort of kill two birds with one stone because he recovered from tuberculosis and he learned what he needed to learn to go back to Ireland and become himself the head doctor at a tuberculosis sanatorium. All right, so that did happen from time to time. And, I would really be curious to know what other doctors who were not specialists in tuberculosis and did not have tuberculosis, how they looked upon sanatoriums and the sanatorium systems. I believe that Grand Duke Dmitri went to a sanatorium because he was urged to do so by his doctor, and specifically to go to Schatzalp because Maurer was such a renowned TB specialist. But, in general, it would be interesting to know how other doctors felt about sanatoriums. But in this instance, the father of this very spoiled young man is a doctor, and he clearly supports the idea of sanatorium treatment. And, there were always cases where a friend of mine who unfortunately has now passed away, he, much older than myself, a World War II veteran, he was sent to, he was an American, he was sent to Arizona as a child because he maybe was looking a little pale or had a cold that he was slow to recover from, or maybe he actually did have pleurisy and TB. He didn't remember having it, but his parents were a little anxious. He was a lonely child, so he was sent 1 year to the desert, which was another option for TB treatment. There were differing ideas about what was the healthiest climate. Some people actually took sea voyages or moved to oceanside towns. Other people went to the desert. Other people went up to the mountains, and there were conflicting and competing ideas about that. One other patient that we have mentioned here is a young lady who's wheezing and who we are told has asthma. So that was something else that could be treated at a sanatorium. Not everybody who went to a sanatorium had tuberculosis. And to this day, I think there are places to get asthma treatment in Davos, and there used to be a kinder clinic, it was called, for children with asthma, and it is no longer a clinic. I don't think it is. But it was when I first started to going to Davos in the 1990s, and up until relatively recent, it was a live-in clinic for children with asthma. Okay, so we have another instance I just want to point out quickly of our friend Hans Castorp sitting in a daze with his mouth open, with his mouth hanging open. We learned when we went back, when we had a chapter about his childhood, that his guardians, he was an orphan, that his guardians were basically getting him drunk every day. I mean, maybe drunk isn't the right word, but he would drink porter. A doctor recommended that he have a glass of porter every day from the time he was about 8 years old, and it would put him in this stuporous state where he'd just sit there with his mouth hanging open, and that became a habit, and that became something that he loved to do. Maybe the modern equivalent would be to, smoke a joint and just like to be in that sort of daisy stuporous state. And so that was what Hans Castorp liked to do, and that was what he continued to do at the sanatorium. This pre-sanatorium hobby or habit of his really sort of predisposed him to be comfortable with life in a sanatorium for 7 years. I don't know if it was most, but I would assume that most people, like Hans's cousin Joachim, wanted to recover and wanted to leave. But Hans Castorp, who liked nothing better than to sit around with his mouth hanging open, very much enjoyed this sense of being in a zone of non-time. But the doctors in the sanatorium could not be blamed for that in his case. That was his own thing, and drinking porter was not part of the treatment for tuberculosis. That was something that he obtained on his own. Okay, and I like here that Thomas Mann, through Hans Castorp, refers to the sanatorium as having, or specifically this scene out in the garden with the music, as having a special intensity and intellectual charm. And I think I agree. I've often thought about that. Grand Duke Dmitri, who's my special topic of research above all else, lived in hotels in Paris before he came after his divorce in 1936, and before he came to the sanatorium in 1939. He basically lived in hotels. But I've never really felt a desire to go to one of those hotels, to the Georges V in Paris or to the Ritz in London, and look up the history, even though, they have such glittering history, these hotels with royalty and probably scandal and so on and so forth. But there was something different about a sanatorium, something to me that makes it very worthwhile to look at the lives of patients and guests at the sanatoriums, to go through these guest lists, to find out as much as I can about the people, because even though it was sort of a sanatorium like Schatzalp was more or less disguised as a grand hotel, there was so much more at play there. There were people fighting for their lives. There were people asking these big existential questions like, Hans Castorp, what is the meaning of my life? Where do I go from here? And there were people, as we've talked about before, who had inner conflicts that were simply brought to the surface by their lives at the sanatoriums. And if you have those things at a hotel, even if it's a resort hotel where people go and stay for a month, it's not quite the same, is it? It's not quite that level of intensity, as Thomas Mann puts it. Okay, and then finally we get to the actual thematic underpinning of this, or focus of this chapter, which is music tied into not music just as music, but music being politically suspect, and music tied into the whole sense of time. And here Hans Castorp's mentor to be comes and has a conversation with the two cousins and talks about how music, they talk a bit about how music is ambiguous. And this is really what Herr Settembrini means when he talks about it being politically suspect. He's using the word not so much to mean, the classic idea of politics, but to be something that is suspicious, because it's ambiguous. It can rouse people to action, as right now in the U.S., it can be very strongly associated with politics and can rouse people in their political zeal from a state of complacency, but it can also sedate people. And specifically, Settembrini is worried about this in the case of Hans Castorp, that it's going to have a sedative effect on him instead of a rousing effect, and that it's going to contribute to him being lost in time. So Joachim says that in his opinion, music lends an awareness to the flow of time, and that's good. But Settembrini wants them to see both sides of that picture. He agrees with Joachim, but he also wants them to see the danger of music. And in fact, he says that at the Berghof, these band concerts, which all patients are expected to make an appearance at, are actually in this instance, music has a pharmaceutical odor to it. So that's very interesting, and I've gone too long, but I'm going to conclude by saying just a little bit about Dimitri's experience. Dimitri was a musician, and a serious one. Basically anything that had strings. He played the balalaika, the ukulele, the guitar, the Russian guitar, which is an instrument with more strings than the conventional guitar, and the mandolin. And music had played such an important part in his life that it surprises me that he doesn't seem to have brought a single instrument with him to Schatzalp, and he never mentions music at all. He liked to go over to the restaurant to have tea, but he never mentions having gone for a concert, or even in passing that there was a concert going on while he was there, although, every Wednesday there was one that he could have gone to. So, that's something that I don't understand, and maybe at some point I'll find something that will shed some more light on that. And so Dimitri was one of these young men or young people, both men and women, who had family who were constantly on the lookout for signs of tuberculosis, because other family members had died of tuberculosis. And so he was very closely watched for any sign of tuberculosis. And on one occasion, when he was about 18, and he was having a great time in Russia that summer, but his father insisted that he come and stay in the German Alps. His father and stepmother were having a family vacation in the German Alps and in Bavaria, and they insisted very much against Dimitri's will that he come and stay with them there, because Dimitri scoffs at the whole thing, but he says that his father was told that that he was already consumptive, and it wasn't true. He was fine, but yeah, people freaked out about it back then, understandably. And when he himself was 15, 16 years old, he was very different from this physician's son who coughs, putting his pinky over his mouth. Not very helpful in terms of spreading the infection. He was, he was quite, he was raised quite strictly. And anytime he seemed to be full of himself, the people who were taking care of him would make sure that he got a dressing down for that. And it really seems to have worked. He was not spoiled like this young man was at 16, and probably probably better suited. If he'd been at a sanatorium at 16, he probably would have been a better patient than this young man with the salt cellar fingernail. But anyway, that's just me slipping some of Dimitri into the whole thing. If you come back next week, the chapter is called Hippe, Hippe, and it's the name of a boy that Hans Castorp just fell head over heels in love with when he was in school. So it's one of the chapters in the book that primarily does not take place in Davos at the sanatorium. It's a recollection of Hans Castorp's school days, although some of it takes place at the sanatorium. And if you don't already know what triggers Hans Castorp to have these childhood memories, it's not cookie dipped into lime tea, it's not music, it's something else. And since I've already had spoiler after spoiler, I can tell you that it is Frau Chauchat, who, interestingly, reminds of Hans Castorp of this first intense crush that he had. So definitely come back for that, and I'll see you then. Bye.